Why is it so hard to get rich in Singapore? Well, that depends on who you ask. On paper, Singapore looks like a paradise for wealth. With a GDP per capita of over 90,000 US dollars, it ranks as one of the richest countries on the planet. Its streets are lined with the Asia-Pacific headquarters of companies like Google, Meta, and Grab. And if a country attracts this much money and top talent, you would think the chance to build personal wealth would be everywhere, right? But talk to an ordinary Singaporean and you might hear a very different story. Recent national surveys show that more than half of young Singaporeans under 35 worry they'll never be able to afford a home, start a family, or reach what many here define as real wealth: private property, financial independence, and long-term security. More and more are quietly asking a question that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Is the Singaporean dream still possible? Here is the paradox. While many young local Singaporeans describe feeling squeezed by the cost of living crisis and lack of opportunities, global entrepreneurs and expats often call Singapore their cheat code for success. They rave about the ultra-low taxes, the business-friendly laws, and the world-class infrastructure that makes building a company feel effortless. To outsiders, Singapore looks like the ultimate launchpad, ranked among the world's top startup ecosystems and a magnet for global wealth. But for many inside, the system feels different. Real opportunity can seem reserved for those with capital, connections, or foreign credentials. And the old belief that hard work alone is enough feels increasingly out of reach. So how can the same country feel like one of the hardest places for young locals to build wealth while being one of the easiest places on earth for global talent to thrive? To answer that, we need to rewind to Singapore's earliest days, when the country had no resources, no allies, and almost no future, until one man's bold vision rewrote its entire destiny. Because only then can we truly understand how the world's ultimate risk-taking startup nation, built on one leader's big bets and fearless decisions, ironically became a society where most young people now feel pressure to play it safe, and making it seems increasingly reserved for a privileged few. Was this by design or a twist that no one saw coming? Before we dive in, if you're trying to make it in Singapore, having an edge matters more than ever. That's why I recommend Revolut, a financial tool we actually use ourselves. We even use Revolut Metal Card, which is fully customizable, and we went with our Stay Curious edition. We liked using Revolut so much that we asked them to offer special deals for you, and they agreed. Revolut isn't just a debit card. Through the app, you get access to improved in-app currency exchange rates. You can hold over 39 currencies and lock in a preferred rate when it's doing well. So if you're traveling, you will know exactly what you're getting before you exchange. And you can skip lining up at money exchangers or airport counters. And it's not just for travel. Revolut is your full financial toolkit. You can track every dollar with their smart budgeting tools, and with their metal card, you get over $2,000 in annual perks, including subscription to Financial Times, ClassPass, and even Tinder Gold. Because being financially savvy is definitely sexy. The best part, if you're among the first 200 people to sign up for Revolut and spend just $1 through this QR code right now, you will get $50 cash back. That's literally extra money for you to spend for your next upcoming travels. So scan the QR code and hit the link in the description before the offer's gone. Now, let's get back to the deep dive. On August 9th, 1965, Singaporeans tuning into the news saw something they never imagined possible. On national television, the Prime Minister of the state of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, sat in front of the cameras, his voice breaking and eyes filling with tears, as he announced that Singapore was leaving the Federation of Malaysia and becoming an independent sovereign state. For many watching, it felt surreal, like the country had just been kicked out of its own future. Just 2 years earlier, in 1963, Singapore had joined the newly formed Federation of Malaysia after a public referendum. Before that, it had been a British Crown colony and then a self-governing state under British oversight from 1959. Joining Malaysia was supposed to be its final step towards full independence from Britain and a way to secure economic survival by plugging into a much larger shared market rather than trying to survive as a tiny city on its own. But deep tensions simmered almost from day one. Singapore entered the Federation as just one state among others, yet it was a majority Chinese city being governed from Kuala Lumpur by a federal leadership dominated by Malay interests. Lee Kuan Yew's People's Action Party, or PAP, pushed the idea of a Malaysian Malaysia, where all citizens, Chinese, Malay, Indian, and others, would have equal political and economic rights. The ruling party in Kuala Lumpur, however, insisted on policies that gave Malays a special position in areas like education, civil service jobs, and access to land. For many Chinese Singaporeans, this felt like second-class status. For many Malay leaders, however, Singapore's push for full equality felt like a direct threat to Malay political dominance and the fragile ethnic balance of the Federation. Economic power struggles made things worse. The federal government wanted to control tariffs, taxes, and trade for the entire country, including Singapore. Singapore, which was more industrialized and dependent on international trade, wanted greater autonomy over its own revenue and economic policy, arguing that its growth model was different from the rest of Malaysia. On paper, the federal government had the constitutional right to central control, so Singapore's assertiveness and separate economic agenda were seen in Kuala Lumpur as defiant and destabilizing. By 1964, the political feud had spilled into the streets. During a huge religious parade celebrating the Prophet Muhammad's birthday, weeks of mistrust and inflammatory talk erupted into open clashes between some Malay marchers and Chinese bystanders. Rumors and accusations on both sides about planned attacks and targeted violence helped turn small fights into full-blown race riots. Violence spread across parts of Singapore, leaving dozens dead and hundreds injured over two major outbreaks that year, with Malay neighborhoods in particular suffering heavy casualties and deepening fears that things were spinning out of control. By mid-1965, Malaysia's Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman concluded that keeping Singapore in the Federation posed too great a risk of further racial violence and political instability. Behind closed doors, he and his senior ministers prepared a separation agreement in secret. Lee Kuan Yew, still Prime Minister of the State of Singapore, took part in last-minute negotiations, but had very limited leverage. Singapore had no real military, depended on Malaysia for water and security, and had no real international backing to fight or even negotiate on equal terms. By the time the legal documents were finalized and brought before the Malaysian Parliament, the outcome was effectively a done deal. So on August 9, 1965, as the separation bill was passed in Kuala Lumpur and announced to the world, Lee Kuan Yew struggled to deliver the news that overnight, the state of Singapore had ceased to exist within Malaysia and been reborn as the Republic of Singapore, a tiny island with no natural resources, no army to defend itself, and no guaranteed future except whatever its people could manage to build from scratch. To give you a sense of where Singapore was at this point, the city-state stood on the brink of disaster. The population was just under 1.89 million people, most crammed into overcrowded slums or basic public housing. GDP per capita was around $500 in 1965, roughly comparable to other poorer economies at the time and far from the levels of today's rich countries. Unemployment hovered around 9%. Strikes and labor unrest were common, and Singapore was mostly known as a colonial trading post, a place where goods passed through, but little of real value was created. You get the idea. Something drastic needed to happen, and Lee was determined to do whatever it took. This is where it gets interesting because he faced a stark choice. Try to go it alone and rely mainly on homegrown capacity, or gamble everything on opening Singapore to the world. To Lee, the choice was clear. He began looking for global partners willing to bet on Singapore's future. His government worked with United Nations advisors and secured development loans from institutions like the World Bank to build ports, power stations, and industrial estates, and to finance basic housing. Foreign experts were brought in to help design this new economic engine, while Singapore poured its limited resources into making itself irresistible to multinational companies. Low and transparent taxes, ruthless anti-corruption, fast and predictable permits, and strong legal protections. This foreigner-first approach was not popular with everyone, but Lee believed that learning from the best, no matter where they come from, was Singapore's only real shot at survival and long-term prosperity. To convince multinationals to set up shop, Lee's team worked tirelessly to make Singapore the Switzerland of Asia, a clean, safe, and hassle-free launchpad for global firms and high-skilled professionals. Foreign engineers, scientists, and bankers were welcome to train locals and transfer skills, helping to build Singapore's reputation for world-class efficiency and reliability. And Lee Kuan Yew's gamble paid off spectacularly. Within a single generation, the same island that once struggled to provide basic jobs and even reliable drinking water became one of the fastest-growing economies on Earth. Per capita income multiplied many times over. Global banks and tech companies began using Singapore as their Asian base, and local families moved from slums into high-rise public housing with modern schools, hospitals, and air-conditioned offices. Even with country's biggest vulnerability, water was slowly turned into a strength. Starting from near total dependence on Malaysia's pipelines, Singapore spent decades building reservoirs, recycling plants, and seawater desalination until it could realistically plan to stand on its own when the last water agreement with Malaysia expires in 2061. In other words, a city that could once be strangled by a turn of the tap is now held up as a global case study in water security and resilience. On paper, the experiment looked like an overwhelming success. Unemployment declined, the skyline filled with glass towers, and Singapore went from third world to one of the richest, safest, and most efficient places on the planet. But hidden inside this success story was a quiet trade-off. The model that made Singapore irresistible to global capital also made it brutally competitive at home, and over time, the gap between how opportunity worked for foreign money and talent and how it fell for ordinary Singaporeans started to widen. Now, it's worth noting that Lee repeatedly framed the strategy as being for all Singaporeans. In speeches through the late 1960s and 1970s, Lee talked explicitly about lifting every Singaporean family out of poverty, rapid modernization, and social mobility. His housing programs were aimed at giving ordinary Singaporeans clean, affordable homes. Education reforms were built around meritocracy, with the promise that even the poorest child could advance through talent and effort. So he pledged that the new Singapore would offer opportunity regardless of race, language, or religion. Still, Lee must have understood that survival came with a hard trade-offs. By courting foreign capital and foreign talent, he knew there would be short-term inequalities and that some locals would lag behind, especially in senior or elite roles that went first to experienced international players. He argued that this was a necessary phase. Singaporeans were expected to catch up by absorbing best practices, working harder, and upgrading their skills. In short, Lee's intent was to lift the whole society, but he consistently prioritized national survival and global relevance, even when that meant real discomfort and visible gaps between foreign and local opportunity along the way. And it's this duality, protecting Singapore through foreign-driven growth while promising fairness at home, that planted the seeds of the paradox younger Singaporeans feel today. A hyper-successful country where stability is real, but local dreams of making it now feels almost impossible. Let's take a look at why that is. Let's zoom in on what might be the most important part of the Singapore dream: getting your own home. Since the 1960s, Singapore's government agency called the Housing and Development Board, better known as HDB, has been building public apartments so everyday Singaporean families could own a place rather than just rent. So HDB units, or flats as they're known in Singapore, are basically government-built public housing. And here's the interesting fact. Around 80% of Singapore's residents live in HDB flats. Most of them buy these flats on a 99-year lease that ultimately returns to the state with government housing grants that can now add up to well over 100,000 Singaporean dollars, or roughly 75,000 US dollars for eligible first-time buyers. Back in the 1960s, a 2-bedroom HDB flat, about 65 square meters or around 700 square feet, might have cost you less than 8,000 Singaporean dollars. That's roughly 2,600 US dollars at the exchange rate back then. Fast forward to 2025, and that exact kind of a flat in a decent neighborhood easily costs 650,000 Singaporean dollars or more. That's close to $500,000 US dollars for public housing. So what changed? First, you need to understand how the system is set up. There are 2 main tracks, the new flat track and the resale track. New flats are offered through something called Build to Order, or BTO. The Singaporean government doesn't just build thousands of units and hope for buyers. They announce a project, wait for enough applicants, and only then break ground. This keeps things efficient and avoids empty blocks. But if they underestimate demand, or if something like the COVID pandemic delays construction, you end up with serious backlogs. Couples still has to get married. Families want to move out to bigger places as their kids grow up. But the new flats they were counting on are suddenly 4, 5, or even 6 years away. So Singaporeans have no choice but to turn to the other track, the resale market. Here's how that works. Once the first owners move into an HDB flat, they're required to stay there for a minimum period of 5 years, thanks to something called the minimum occupation period. After that, they're allowed to sell on the open market. At this point, all those government subsidies drop away, and prices are set by good old supply and demand. And it's this free market force that's been pushing up HDB prices like crazy because everyone starts bidding. We're talking young couples who don't want to wait 5 years for a brand new BTO flat, existing homeowners who want to upgrade to a bigger place. And then there are investors and high-income buyers who see HDB flats as safe places to park their money in Singapore's super tight real estate market. Put it all together and resale prices keep breaking records. As of the first 9 months of 2025 alone, there were over $1,200 million HDB resale flat transactions, something that was once unthinkable because public housing was designed as an affordable option. So imagine you're a young Singaporean, late 20s, maybe early 30s. You and your partner both have degrees, steady jobs, maybe bringing in $4,000 to $5,000 a month each. But when a basic 2-bedroom resale flat is now going for $600,000 or more, and you need at least a 10% down payment for the loan, and the mortgage payment alone could hit $2,500, maybe $3,000 a month every month for the next 25 to 30 years. That's a huge chunk of your combined salary locked in no matter what happens to your job, your health, or the wider economy. Again, just to be clear, this isn't for some high-rise luxury condo. This is basic public housing that helped their parents and grandparents climb into the middle class. So when today's young Singaporeans say things like, "It's harder for us than it was for our parents," it's not an exaggeration, and they're already starting behind the 8 ball. And housing is just the first punch. On top of that comes the broader cost of living squeeze made worse by Singapore's unique geography. As a tiny island with almost no natural resources, almost everything has to be brought in from somewhere else. When global prices spike, there's nowhere to hide. For example, a dozen eggs in Singapore now costs about $4.50, nearly double or even triple the price in neighboring Malaysia. Almost every grocery items here is marked up by shipping and import fees. What makes this even more frustrating is that so much of this price pressure isn't created in Singapore at all. During and after COVID, major economies around the world, like the US and Europe, pumped huge amounts of money into their systems, literally by printing money to keep markets and jobs from collapsing. That global wave of stimulus and ultra-low interest rates helped fuel asset booms and higher prices everywhere for food, energy, and goods. So even if Singapore's official inflation rate stays modest, Singaporean families still feel the pinch of years of global money printing every time they check out at the supermarket. By the way, public transport in Singapore is super efficient and relatively affordable. But the moment you talk about owning a car, you're in a completely different universe. By the time you add Singapore's unique certificate of entitlement on top of the car sticker price, even a modest family car, like a Toyota Corolla for example, can cost well over 150,000 Singaporean dollars or around 110,000 US dollars, something that feels like science fiction to most middle-class families elsewhere. And then there's childcare and education. A full-day preschool place can easily run into 4 figures every month, over 1,000 US dollars or more at many private ones, even before you add the optional tuition and extra classes that parents feel pressured to pay just so that their kids don't fall behind in Singapore's ultra-competitive system. But the real squeeze for most Singaporeans isn't just about earning enough or paying the bills, though that's a huge part of it. It's how they're stretched in every direction at once. A typical young or middle-aged adult isn't just facing rent or mortgage payments and student loans. They're also expected to support aging parents, fund the child's preschool and tuition, and keep up in a corporate culture known for long hours, non-stop competition, and relentless pressure not to fall behind. Recent surveys show that over 60% of Singaporean workers feel burnt out, one of the highest rates in Asia. For many, the fear of lagging behind means fewer holidays, late nights, and rarely saying no to extra work. Add this to rising costs and shrinking margins for error, and it's easy to see why so many locals feel constantly stressed, always one setback away from falling behind. In an environment like this, is it really possible for the average person to take big risks, like starting their own business or even just switching careers? Probably not. And if risk is off the table, so is the chance to really climb the social ladder. Which begs the question, can Singapore produce true risk takers and innovators in a system built for stability rather than boldness? The reality is, these barriers to risk taking start much earlier. In Singapore, there's a common Singlish expression called Kiasu, which comes from a Hokkien Chinese phrase literally meaning afraid to lose. But Kiasu is much more than just a word. It's this whole mindset of fear of missing out on steroids, an obsessive, anxiety-driven need to get your money's worth and never, ever be at a disadvantage compared to your neighbor. Basically, it's about playing it safe, shying away from risks, and sometimes being a little too cautious just in case things don't go your way. So where does this mindset actually come from? From our research, setting aside the housing issue we already talked about, where young people feel locked into stable employment just to service their mortgage, 3 major forces stand out in shaping the Singaporean psyche: the education system, national service, especially for Singaporean men, and the broader environment for startups and entrepreneurship. Let's start with the education system. Kids in Singapore are sorted and ranked by exam scores almost from the moment they start school. The big one is the primary school leaving examination, or PSLE, taken at just 12 years old. It can literally decide which secondary school or even which life track a kid can land on. For a lot of families, this means maximizing scores is everything. Extra classes on weekends, holiday tuition, drilling for the next test. Now imagine what this does to young minds. The system rewards precision, compliance, and memorization of right answers. There's always right or wrong answer. Mistakes or creative detours feel risky because the margin for error is almost non-existent. Think about it. A single misstep on an exam can close doors for years just because you don't end up getting into the right secondary school or the right university. To be fair, This kind of academic performance-driven system exists in many Asian countries, like China and South Korea. But in Singapore's hyper-competitive, pressure cooker environment, year after year, students grow up believing that there's only one right path to success, defined not by personal interests, but by social norms. Being different or trying something new feels like a gamble with huge opportunity costs and lifelong consequences. Simply put, in their minds, there's no such thing as a second chance in life if you fail even once. To address this issue, in 2024, the Singaporean government officially abolished the rigid express and normal streams and replaced them with a full subject-based banding, or FSBB. This allows students to take different subjects at different difficulty levels, instead of being labeled a failure in a lower stream. There are now more second chances and more bridges between polytechnics and universities than ever before. But despite these policy changes, the mindset of the population hasn't caught up. Parents who grew up in the harsh one mistake and you're out system still parents with that same fear, passing down the anxiety of no second chances down to their kids. It's little wonder that by the time many Singaporeans reach adulthood, their instinct is to shy away from any move that isn't clearly safe or predictable. I actually had a chance to interview a Singaporean founder and get his perspective on this deep-rooted mindset. Here's what he had to say.
I think the way that we think about job security really starts from our parents, right? So right from the start, when we're growing up, our parents are telling us, hey, you gotta get good grades. You gotta make sure that you study hard, you work hard, and then you can have a nice, stable life for yourself. Make sure that you're, getting into a good job, and you can support your own family. That's really important, I think, in the context of Singapore. So that's something that even my parents kind of drilled into me while growing up. To me, the typical education system kind of trains you into learning the basic skills that you're going to need to get on to the next stage of the education system. So all the way from primary school to secondary school, to junior college, when I was in the education system, I felt that a lot of it was, okay, you have to pass this really important exam so you get to the best school, right? There's nothing really going on further beyond that. It was always, okay, you're going into a really good primary school, and then after that, can you get to the really, really good secondary school? And then after that, you have to graduate that secondary school to make sure you go to junior college, which has to be really good as well. And then after that, look at the best university you can go to, and then you go to that as well. So it's always what's the next step ahead, which felt to me always a bit narrow, because it was always, oh, is it about what I'm going to do for the rest of my life? Not really. It's about which next best tertiary institution I can get to so that I can potentially make something for myself. It tends to, I guess, shrink your view into thinking that the exam is the most important thing in the world, where in reality it really isn't.
Then there's the issue of national service, which is pretty unique to Singapore. And honestly, I didn't even know this type of system existed for Singaporean men until we did our research. Almost every Singaporean male citizen is conscripted for a minimum of 2 years of national service soon after turning 18, usually right after they finish school, serving full-time in the army, police, or civil defense. What this means is that Singaporean men end up 2 years behind their foreign peers who are heading off to universities, starting internships, or even launching their first startups. They arguably lose out on a window of time that could have been used to try new things, make mistakes, or even travel and broaden their horizons. But day to day, national service is all about discipline, hierarchy, and obedience. You wake up when you're told, march when you're told, and eat whatever you're told. And you learn very quickly that questioning orders isn't the way to get by. For a conscript army, that makes sense. You need everyone to follow instructions, move as a unit, and avoid improvising on the fire. Cool. But if you have to look at it from the perspective of building future innovators and risk takers, it could send the exact opposite signal. Don't challenge the system. By the time Singaporean men finish their service, many are already deeply conditioned to respect rank, rules, and procedure. And remember, this is all before they even enter university or their first job. 2 of their most formative years have been spent in a world where conformity is rewarded and risk is punished. as if that hadn't already been drilled into them throughout their entire schooling. At this point, you might be wondering, wait, what's wrong with having a stable job and pursuing some sense of security? Why do I even have to go against the system? Fair question. There is nothing wrong with running a secure life, okay? But if current trends continue, and by that I mean cost of living rising in absolute terms, local competition getting more and more cutthroat in a small country of just about 6 million people, more jobs being automated away by AI, and the middle class slowly shrinking, what kind of future does that create for ordinary Singaporeans? Is it really realistic to just rely on the government to take care of you? This is part of why the Singaporean government has been pouring major resources into the startup ecosystem, committing over 25 billion Singaporean dollars in recent years to grants, co-investment schemes, and innovation funds to encourage more entrepreneurs to build companies and create high-value jobs locally. Again, in theory, that sounds great. Ambitious locals and talented foreigners alike can get support, and Singapore as a whole moves up the economic value chain. In reality though, homegrown Singaporean founders often find themselves competing head-to-head with an influx of international founders, people who see Singapore as the kind of cheat code for success as we already talked about. So all of a sudden, not only do local founders have to overcome years of cultural and societal conditioning of always playing it safe, just to face the ultimate gamble of building a company from scratch, but they also have to compete with global founders aiming to build at a world-class level. Here's how the Singaporean startup founder I interviewed describes the challenge.
I would say maybe 3 out of 100 to like 5 out of 100 would want to start a business right out of university. To be fair, myself, I didn't start a business right out of university. I joined a startup first, kind of learned a bit of the ropes, and then 5 years later, I started my own business.
So let's say you are ready to start a business as a local founder, maybe after some corporate experience, whatnot. What do you think right now is the toughest part about starting a business in Singapore as a local Singaporean?
There are a lot of government support programs out there. The first one I can think of is the Startup SG Founder Grant, which immediately gives you $50,000 to start your own startup. I think it is the opportunity cost. Yeah, so like $50,000 is a bit of money, right? But then if you're comparing it to the average Singapore salary, is that going to really get you all that far? Yeah, so there is definitely an opportunity cost. If you're already in a really stable job, are you really going to leave that and then like try and start something, which 95% of the time is going to fail. That's the statistics, right? And you of course get a nice little like bonus to get it started with, but then how do you keep that going? And after that, are you going to be able to re-enter the workforce that you've already left? Right. So I think that would probably be a strong consideration for quite a number of Singaporeans.
As one of the leaders in this field, somebody who still keeps going, what are some of the common limitations, if any, do you see for local founders versus international founders?
To me, I think Singaporeans need to know that like actually we're pretty solid as a people, right? Like our education system, while it might be rigid in some places, has given us a lot of advantages in terms of like it's a really well-respected education system. It builds out a lot of what we need to do like what all the knowledge that we need to succeed in life. So Singaporeans really just need to be able to step up and not, feel like we are at all inferior to anybody else on the planet just because we're a small country, right? I think like one of the things that Singaporeans tend to have difficulty with is presenting ourselves. Yeah, and I have a couple of colleagues right now in my company that also have that kind of difficulty. They have great ideas. They have like amazing like work ethic as well. But the only problem is you put them up on a stage and they kind of fumble, right? So like to me, it's about that kind of showmanship as well. Right. So being able to present yourself well, be able to present your ideas and make people believe you. Right. I think that's something that, I feel like generally With the exception of like some pretty talented individuals, I feel like we do like that.
So the Singapore's founder, Lee Kuan Yew, built this country by doing the very thing many Singaporeans now shy away from, taking enormous, calculated risks with no guarantee of success. In a way, the founding generation took the ultimate gamble so that future generations could grow up inside the ultimate bubble, a place where everything just works and life feels safe and predictable. But the question now is whether that bubble can withstand the next set of shocks that could upend everything the founder fought so hard to build. Because the truth is, Singapore's birth rate is plummeting right now with a total fertility rate of around 0.97, which means severe future labor shortages, a shrinking tax base, and an even heavier burden on the next generation. This also means Singapore will have to rely on foreign labor even more. At the same time, an increasing number of young Singaporeans are leaving in search of better opportunities abroad because they're fully aware of how limited upward social mobility can feel at home. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that Singapore's decline is guaranteed. Maybe things will be okay by simply letting in more and more foreign workers and immigrants. But at what cost? The Singaporean government can keep offering more grants and bringing global talent. But what may truly be missing is giving homegrown Singaporeans the space to fail, learn, and try again without being written off, and celebrating those who dare to dream, build, create, and experiment, even when the outcome isn't guaranteed. Because if there's one group that understands what Singaporean needs for its next chapter, it's the people who grew up with Singapore, the ones who know its promise and its potential far better than any outsiders ever could. In the end, only Singaporeans can decide whether Singapore remains a bubble or reinvent itself as a place of bold ideas again. If you found this video insightful, be sure to subscribe to Asian Boss and share it with your friends and colleagues. What we really aim to do is go beyond the mainstream headlines and educate and inform the global audience on what's really going on in Asia. It takes a lot of deep research, and honestly, we might not get everything right. So we need you to pitch in. Your perspective can and will help us inform the global audience better than the mainstream media ever could. So share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so that we can cover more countries and topics and even bring on high-profile experts, some of whom still think that we are too small to bother with. Our mission is to bring you the most authentic and in-depth insights from all across Asia. With your support, we'll keep creating more content to inspire and empower the next generation of leaders, innovators, and creators. I'm Stephen Park, and I really appreciate having you on this journey with us. Thank you so much for watching until the end, and as always, stay curious.